Hey guys, I want to do a video today and look at the Abomination of Desolation. The Abomination of Desolation is spoken of by Daniel the prophet. We're going to look at the times where it is mentioned in the book of Daniel. It's also referred to by Jesus in the Olivet Discourse. And so we're going to look at those passages. And let's begin at Luke 21:20, because Jesus, speaking to his disciples of that generation, of a time upcoming where they are going to see something occur. And when this occurs, to be prepared, be ready, because there's a desolation that is going to take place. In Luke 21:20, Jesus says, "And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh." So when the armies of a particular empire surrounds Jerusalem during their generation at that time, he's talking to his disciples and saying, when ye see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is not. He's speaking of a desolation of the city itself. He's also speaking of a desolation, an abomination of desolation that is to be set up. So let's look further in Matthew 24, verses 15 and 16 now. Jesus again, "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains." So Jesus is speaking to his disciples, and we learn in the book of Mark that it's a private discussion with the disciples Peter, Andrew, James, and John, speaking of these end times event for their generation that they would see during their lifetime. So Jesus is telling them at that time, that generation, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. So he says, you're going to see this. You're going to see it, and it's what Daniel was talking about in the book of Daniel. In the book of Mark, again, Jesus' words, "But when ye shall see the abomination of desolation," again, speaking to his disciples, that generation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not. We saw on the previous standing in the holy place. This says, "Stand where it ought not. Let him that readeth understand. Then let them that be in Judea flee to the mountains." Again, a warning to get out of Jerusalem. When you see the armies compassing the city of Jerusalem, the desolation is nigh. So get out. And when you see the abomination of desolation set up where it ought not in the holy place, your generation, this is something that you're going to see. And this is something that is in the book of Daniel for your generation. It was sealed at the time when it was written during Babylonian captivity. But the seal is open. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Olivet Discourse, these were all written, Jesus' words of these end times event for that generation. John wrote a specific vision, and he wrote that in the book of Revelation. And so we see the book of Revelation written just prior to these events that Jesus is speaking of here at the Olivet Discourse. The book of Revelation was written with a separate vision by John sent to the 7 churches. And they expand on the book of Daniel because the time is at hand. It's something that's going to happen very soon. And the book of Revelation was not sealed like the book of Daniel because it was for that generation. Basically, Jesus and his disciples were all showing that the book of Daniel and the abomination of desolation and everything you read about this upcoming event where there's a desolation that's going to occur is for you. It's for you, and be ready. So now let's look at the book of Daniel and see exactly what it is. And we'll start with Daniel 7:7, when It's speaking of the fourth beast. And we know this fourth beast is the Roman Empire. The first beast being Babylon, the second being the Medes and Persians, and the third being the Greek Empire. The fourth beast, the Roman Empire, is what this is describing in Daniel 7:7. When it says, "After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces and stamped the residue with the feet of it, and it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things." And we'll see a little more of this little horn that's introduced in Daniel 7. But this little horn that arises in Daniel 7 is within the Roman Empire, not another empire, not the Babylonian Empire during Daniel's generation, not the Medes and Persian Empire that took over after the Babylonian Empire, and not the Greek Empire, not any of those empires. It was the fourth beast that this little horn came out of. And so now let's get a little more information about this little horn in Daniel 8. And we'll start to see some of the acts and events that he does. Daniel 8:11. "Yea, speaking of the little horn, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down." In verse 12, "And a host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered." So now we see a little more of what this little horn does. By taking away the daily sacrifice, the place of sanctuary was cast down, and a host was given him against this city, against this Levitical system. And it cast down and prospered. So now let's continue in the book of Daniel, where we're introduced to Daniel's 70 weeks in Daniel 9. And we've done a couple of videos recently on that. But in verse 27, the last of the 4 verses on Daniel's 70 weeks in the passage, it says, "And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week." This is speaking of the prince that shall come, that's described in verse 26. "And in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease." This is speaking of the prince that shall come. This is speaking of the little horn that was introduced in Daniel 7 and that we learn more about in Daniel 8. "And for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate." Again, talking about this desolation, this abomination of desolation that's going to occur. It's going to occur during the 70th week, and it's going to occur during the Roman Empire, and this little horn is going to be the one that does it. "Even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate." So now let's go to Daniel 11. And Daniel 11:21 speaks of this vile person. And from that point on till the end of the chapter, it is speaking of this one person. This vile person in Daniel 11:21 that we see here in what he does in 11:31, and we'll just read it. "And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice," just like we heard about in Daniel 7, Daniel 8, about the little horn, "and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate." So this is what Jesus is speaking of when he talks about the abomination of desolation being set up where it ought not, in the holy place. And this is who's going to do it. It's for your generation, the generation of Jesus' disciples. We're going to see this. And this is what Daniel the prophet was speaking of. And then in Daniel 12:11, to finish about the abomination of desolation and all the references in the book of Daniel, it says, "And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days." And so Daniel, in the latter half of the book of Daniel, after the 70 weeks is introduced, he begins to talk about these days, these 1,260 days, these 1,290 days, these 1,335 days, these 2,300 days. And, there's been so much written about this. But that's why we see these same numbers in the book of Revelation with the times, half time, the 42 months, the 3.5 years, then the 1,290 days that you see in the book of Daniel. It's because that this is a very specific time that Jesus, that Daniel, that John in the book of Revelation is pointing that generation to, when the midpoint of the 70th week kicks off. So you'll know exactly what's going on, and all these prophecies that are going to occur afterwards, you're going to experience them in this generation. When the armies compass Jerusalem, know that the desolation is not. That is at 1,260 days. That's at the halfway point. That's when the prince that shall come breaks his covenant. And that's 30 days after 1,290 days is when the abomination of desolation is actually set up. It took 1 month for this abomination of desolation to be set up in the holy place. After the prince that shall come, the little horn, the Antichrist, broke his covenant, and the armies of Rome surrounded Jerusalem and began to destroy it, destroy the city, desecrate the temple, and set up this image. This is what was set up, and this is the abomination of desolation. So what is the abomination of desolation? And you see here a pig snout. And I've seen recent videos talking about Antiochus Epiphanes possibly being the little horn, possibly being who set up the abomination of desolation. But Jesus wasn't pointing his disciples to be looking for a Greek ruler who died almost 200 years before their generation. It has nothing to do with Antiochus Epiphanes. By the time you get to the vile person in Daniel 11, as it goes from the earlier points over several centuries, it is past the Greek time. It is past the Greek Empire and is transitioning into the Roman Empire, into the Roman Empire that was established at that time for that generation. Nothing to do with Antiochus Epiphanes. The pig sacrifice that he reportedly did in historical texts and extra biblical texts, this is not the abomination of desolation. It doesn't fit Daniel's 70 weeks, and it happened well before Jesus spoke the words to his disciples, "When ye see the abomination of desolation set up." And this is what Daniel the prophet was speaking of. Then flee to the mountains. Get out of Judea, because there's a desolation that is going to take place. It has nothing to do with Antiochus Epiphanes. And that whole teaching is simply a distraction to get you away from what is actually pointing to. And the futurist view does this all the time with the red heifer sacrifice that they're looking forward to, the third temple being built that they're looking forward to. So all these prophecies that's already occurred that they don't think has occurred, that they are getting things set up so that they can have a future abomination of desolation. But the abomination of desolation was set up at the time when Jesus said it was going to be set up. During that generation, it was set up in Jerusalem. It was set up after the temple was desecrated, and it was desecrated by the building of this image. And I think this is what the image looked like. And we see this again spoken of in the Olivet Discourse by Jesus in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John speaks of the abomination of desolation, I believe, as the image of the beast in Revelation 13. I think this is what was set up, and I think this is what it looked like. God bless.